Right, folks, so it is 1 o'clock and we are going to go ahead and get started with this afternoon's webinar. Before we begin, just a note that this event is being recorded and will be distributed to registrants approximately 1 week following the live event. We also have time at the end allotted for questions and answers. I know some of you may have a lot of them, so we do have time allotted for that. You may submit your questions through the Q&A function. And for technical support questions related to Zoom, we do have that available. We also have ASL interpreters who are available to pin, or you can click the interpretation button on your Zoom toolbar and select ASL to populate the interpreter in a separate window. Closed captioning is also available through the Zoom menu bar. And so with that, I bid you all good afternoon. We would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Outsourcing to Third-Party Providers. What should I know? Next slide. And again, before we begin, I'd like to call your attention to this disclaimer. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent along with you, as I just stated, along with an evaluation survey within a week. We ask you not to make your own recording or otherwise reproduce this presentation. To request permission to share the recording once you receive access to it, please email president@msche.org. Please also note that the information provided in this presentation is general in nature. You should rely on your institution's appointed Vice President Liaison and other MSCHE staff members for specific information that is relevant to your institution. Next slide. So I would like to take this time to introduce myself and 3 of my colleagues who are here with me today to talk to you more about third-party providers. My name is Bridget Booty, and I serve as the Commission's Director for Policy and Records Management. I am also joined today by Dr. Amy Moseder, Senior Vice President for Policy and Administrative Services. And we are also joined today by 2 other colleagues, Dr. Tracy Schneider, Senior Vice President for Legal Affairs and General Counsel, and Dr. Judith Seipel, Vice President for Institutional Field Relations. This webinar is designed with several learning objectives in mind. First, those who attend should gain a broad awareness of Commission expectations around arrangements with third-party providers. We hope that you walk away with an understanding of the scope of the new third-party providers policy and how the Commission defines third-party providers. We have also designed this presentation to help participants understand the process of review during accreditation activities and understand the requirements for written arrangements, as well as applicatory regulatory requirements. Next slide. Today, we will review Commission expectations for working with third-party providers and the definition and scope of these kinds of relationships when considered by the Commission. We will also discuss Commission review and approval of relationships with third-party providers, including how third-party providers may be monitored through accreditation activities and submitted for approval during the substantive change process. Finally, we will walk through the regulatory environment around third-party providers. To begin, we will take a moment to discuss Commission expectations related to third-party providers. Next slide. As you may be aware, the Commission recently released its revised Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation, 14th edition, and new Evidence Expectations by Standard Guidelines. Our standards inform our policies. These documents explicitly address the evaluation of third-party providers across multiple standards. The evidence expectations by standard guidelines provide examples of evidence that demonstrate compliance with the new standards. We will talk more about evidence to demonstrate compliance in later slides. Here, we remind you of the Commission standards for accreditation, and we will again talk about specific standards that address third-party providers later in the presentation, specifically standards 3, 4, and 5. Next slide. A complete list of the Commission's policies, procedures, and templates are available on the MSCHE website under msche.org/policies-guidelines. Today, we will focus on a new MSCHE policy that became effective on January 1, 2024, called Third-Party Providers Policy and Third-Party Providers Procedures. The new policy consolidates information found in older policies and updates the Commission's expectations for working with third-party providers. The new third-party providers policy and procedures are also tied to the Commission's substantive change policy, procedures, and guidelines, along with our standards and evidence expectations. We will delve again more into third-party providers as it relates to substantive change later in the presentation. Because the new policy consolidates information found in older policy and updates the Commission's expectations for working with third-party providers, the former policy documents called Contracts by Accredited and Candidate Institutions for Education-Related Services, International Programs Offered by Accredited Institutions, and Third-Party Providers Guidelines have been withdrawn. The new third-party providers policy has provisions that are designed for institutions to uphold quality, integrity, control, and ownership of all activities conducted in its name. Institutions must clearly define the terms of agreements with third-party providers. They must maximize transparency and disclosure of such arrangements, and they must conform to best practices in higher education and adhere to applicable laws and regulations. Next slide. The institution is responsible for the management, assessment, oversight, and support of third-party providers that deliver services and programs on its behalf. The institution must establish a process for the development, review, and approval of arrangements with third-party providers, which is then documented in policy and procedures. Review will be conducted by appropriately credentialed representatives, such as legal counsel, in accordance with any institutional policy and procedures. The institution will also ascertain and obtain all internal and external approval requirements for arrangements with third-party providers, including but not limited to the governing body, state or system administration, government, accrediting agencies, or other legal entities. The institution is responsible for the accuracy of information related to an arrangement with a third-party provider, including the accurate representation of the role of the third-party provider and all required public disclosures. This is definitely something that we did try to emphasize when we revised the policy and procedures. And finally, the institution should regularly assess and evaluate third-party providers. These principles should be evident in the evidence provided by the institution under our standards. Next slide. We also want to take a moment to talk about accurate representation. The institution is responsible for accuracy of information related to an arrangement with a third-party provider, including the accurate representation of the role of the third-party provider and all required public disclosures. The institution must maintain all oversight of marketing, advertising, and recruitment. Disclosures must be in clear, concise, and student-focused language. The role and titles of staff from third-party providers must be accurately represented. And written arrangements or contracts that outsource marketing, recruitment, and advertising to third-party providers will receive intense scrutiny. The institution must ensure ethical marketing practices. The Commission may become aware of misrepresentation in arrangements with third-party providers. This may occur through media reports, third-party comments, or supplemental information reports. If there is appearance of misrepresentation or mischaracterization of the relationship with the third-party provider, the role of the third-party provider, or any services that they may provide, the Commission may take an action available to it in accordance with its accreditation actions, policy, and procedures. And with that, I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Amy Moseder.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm going to talk about the definition of third-party provider and how that term is limited within the scope of the policy and procedures. Third-party provider is broadly defined in the policy and procedures as an entity, institution, or organization that has a contract or written arrangement to provide services to the institution. This broad definition is intentional because there are many different types of third-party providers with different requirements and considerations. Some arrangements will be reviewed during accreditation activities, while others, known as written arrangements, require review and approval prior to implementation. Applicable contracts or arrangements are reviewed during accreditation activities within the context of the Commission's standards for accreditation and requirements of affiliation and evidence expectations by standard guidelines. Several of our standards require an evaluation of arrangements with third-party providers, especially where providers have a direct impact on students and student services. So this could include any kind of student learning opportunity, student support services, assessment of student learning, or key operational or business functions. The arrangement could be with an eligible or ineligible third-party provider. A third party is considered ineligible if it is not accredited by a United States Department of Education recognized accreditor and is not certified to participate in Title IV programs. Articulation agreements and transfer agreements are a good example of arrangements with an eligible third-party provider. And you should discuss these in your self-study and provide the required evidence, but approval is not required for articulation agreements and transfer agreements. Specifically, the term written arrangement is a federal definition, and it is an arrangement between an institution and an ineligible third-party provider that will deliver 25% or more of a credit-bearing educational program. Written arrangements must be reviewed and approved prior to implementation through substantive change, and this is mandated in federal regulation. Next slide. I'll quickly run through this list of the primary types of services that are considered within the scope of the policy, and then I will provide you with some examples under each type. The policy and procedures are largely limited in scope to the types of services that have a direct impact on students and student support services. So first, the delivery of student learning opportunities, which falls under standards 3 and 4. I want to point out that in standard 4, criterion 5, institutions should be prepared to provide an analysis of services offered by online program managers or OPMs. This is something that the Commission looks at to assess the delivery of distance education courses and programs. As a point of clarity, OPMs provide technical support services, but they may also deliver instruction for educational programs as part of their services. So when an OPM delivers instruction and the percentage offered is 25% or more of the educational program, it is considered a written arrangement. Written arrangements require prior approval by the Commission through substantive change. But I want to repeat that the institution should be analyzing its use of an OPM under standard 4, regardless of whether the OPM delivers. Second is the student support services area, which falls under standard 4, criterion 5. And third, we have services for the assessment of student learning, which falls under standard 5, criterion 4. And then finally, operational or business functions of the institution that otherwise are or could be carried out internally, outsourced, would fall under standard 6, criterion 10. So the Commission's review of third-party providers does not include contracts that are solely for goods, books, supplies, products, equipment, or software programs. And this is consistent with the Commission's substantive change guidelines. Next slide. Student learning opportunities include various types of educational experiences. The Commission provides a definition for student learning opportunities in the policy and procedures, and they include but are not limited to non-credit, workforce development, internships, clinical experiences, student teaching, study abroad, and/or credit-bearing educational courses. Student learning opportunities can be delivered via different modalities, including classroom, online, blended, self-guided, mixed delivery, coaching, mentoring, and/or experiential coursework. Again, written arrangements are a subset of student learning opportunities. They are credit-bearing educational programs when 25% or more of the program will be delivered by an ineligible third party. So delivery means teaching or instruction, but as I mentioned earlier, it can also be a combination of services that might include teaching along with curriculum development, instructional design, online delivery of courses, marketing and recruiting, tutoring or advising, and so on. The Commission encourages institutions to reach out to the Commission VP liaison with questions about written arrangements and the requirements for substantive change. Next slide. Student support services are covered in Standard 4 and include services that directly impact students. The institution is responsible for ensuring that third-party providers employ ethical practices in advising, counseling, tutoring, admissions. Next slide. Marketing, recruitment, advertising, food or dining services, international student management, such as English as a second language, or ESL. Next slide. Under Standard 5, services related to the assessment of student learning are included within the scope of the policy. Many institutions work with third-party providers to conduct assessment. The commission needs to be assured that the institution oversees the overall assessment effort and is the one interpreting assessment results and linking those results back to budgeting and planning. Next slide. Standard 6 covers the institution's use of resources. The policy and procedures include key business functions that the institution has outsourced to a third-party provider, such as procurement, human resources, campus safety, or information security. And the institution should analyze its use of third-party providers and the level of outsourcing. The commission does not set a threshold limit for the level of outsourcing that is acceptable, and the level of outsourcing is reviewed within the context of the institution. Next slide. I want to take a few minutes to explain another commission term, related entity, and how it is possible that a related entity can also be a third-party provider. A related entity is an entity regardless of form that is legally distinct from the institution, but has a relationship, connection, or interdependency with the institution. Some may not realize it, but some institutions with related entities can enter into shared services agreements or operational agreements, wherein the related entity provides operational business functions for the institution. Likewise, some related entities may even provide a portion of a program for an institution. In these cases, the related entity is also a third-party provider. So this type of arrangement is one that the commission will look at and expect a sampling of contracts during accreditation activities under Standard 7. Here I'm referencing the evidence expectations by standard guidelines, as well as Section 3H of the third-party providers procedures. Next slide. On the screen, you'll just see a repeat of the definition of a related entity, and that definition is provided in the policy document at the end. To find the document on the MSCHE website, you can click on the link in the slides, which will be sent to all registrants following this live event. Next slide. This is continuing the definition, and so here it provides some examples of what constitutes a related entity, such as an individual, partnership, corporation, other entity, layer, or group of ownership. Or it could also be a subsidiary, affiliate, or controlled or supporting organization. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague this time.
All right, thank you, Dr. Moseder. We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the commission review and approval of third-party providers. At the time of application, candidacy, grant of accreditation, self-study evaluation, substantive change, and at any other time deemed relevant, the commission will review the institution's use of third-party providers to determine if they appear to demonstrate continued compliance with the commission's standards for accreditation and requirements of affiliation, the 14th edition, evidence expectations by standard guidelines, policies and procedures, and applicable federal regulatory requirements. The commission's review will focus on the use of third-party providers that have a direct impact on students. Dr. Moseder shared some examples earlier in the presentation, which include the delivery of student learning opportunities, student support services, and assessment services, as well as the provision of key operational or business functions which otherwise could be carried out internally. The revised policy and procedures require an institution to demonstrate that it has a process to review and monitor its relationships with third-party providers. It also outlines specific content which must be addressed in written arrangements, contracts, and agreements between the institution and the third-party provider. The Commission will not conduct a retroactive review of existing contracts, but instead applies the policy and procedure as of the effective policy date. Therefore, this specific content applies to contracts that are fully executed on or after January 1st, 2024. And finally, the Commission conducts ongoing monitoring activities and, in accordance with our accreditation review cycle and monitoring policy and procedures, will request a supplemental information report if an issue with a third-party provider is identified. Next slide. During accreditation activities such as the self-study, the institution's approach to managing and overseeing third-party providers is reviewed. Standards 3, 4, and 5 have specific criteria that require the institution to demonstrate adequate and appropriate institutional review and approval of any student learning opportunities, student support services, and assessment services that are designed, delivered, or assessed by third-party providers. And you can see those criteria listed on the screen. Next slide. In addition, under Standard 6, institutions should consider any key business functions and operations that are outsourced to a third-party provider, as the policy and procedures apply to those functions as well. Next slide. For Standards 3, 4, and 5, the evidence expectations by standard lists the evidence that institutions must provide to demonstrate compliance. The evidence that is common across these three standards includes institutional policies, procedures, or guidance for the process of development and approval of third-party providers, a complete list of current third-party providers delivering education-related services and/or a portion of an educational program, support service, or assessment service. This list must include the name of the program, service, or operation, the percent of service provided, and a description of the services offered by the third party. Institutions must also provide a sample of written agreements and/or contracts. And finally, institutions must provide evidence of evaluation of third-party providers, the consideration of results, and follow-up when warranted. Through peer review, the Commission will review this evidence to ensure that the institution maintains control and oversight and maintains ethical practices in relation to third-party providers. Next slide. In addition to the evidence on the previous slide, which is common across Standards 3, 4, 5, and 6, the Commission requires the submission of further evidence specific to Standards 3, 4, and 5. In Standard 3, institutions must also submit documentation, including the URL of required disclosure of educational programs when a portion is delivered by a third-party provider. In Standard 4, institutions are required to provide an analysis of services offered by online program managers, and we heard Dr. Moseder speak about this. I'm going to reiterate it to include a list of educational programs delivered by OPMs, the percentage of educational programs offered by OPMs, agreements and contracts with OPMs, and a description of services offered by OPMs, such as delivery of instruction, recruiting and marketing services, support services, faculty training, qualifications, or compensation, and instructional delivery. And in Standard 5, institutions also need to submit evidence of periodic assessment of third-party providers to include assessment instruments and analysis of collected data. Next slide. In accordance with the Commission's Substantive Change Policy and Procedures, Substantive Change Guidelines, and federal regulations, the Commission requires a substantive change request for all domestic and international written arrangements when the third-party provider or non-accredited entity delivers 25% or more of a credit-bearing educational program. The Commission will not review domestic written arrangements when the third party provides more than 50%. Federal regulations require the Commission to review and approve written arrangements prior to implementation. Written arrangement is a term defined in federal regulation wherein an institution outsources some portion of one or more of its educational programs or educational business operations to a third-party provider that is ineligible or not accredited and is not certified to participate in Title IV programs. The Commission also requires approval for the substantial modification of an existing written arrangement. If a contract is renegotiated, the terms change substantially, or the percentage offered by the third-party provider increases significantly, for example, from 25% to 45%, the institution should revisit the contract and discuss the implications for substantive change with the Commission staff. The services provided by the third party must include the delivery of instruction for a credit-bearing or Title IV eligible course or educational program, but may also include some combination of services, including but not limited to establishing the requirements for admission or completion of the course, delivery of mandatory tutoring, curriculum development, online delivery of courses, student services, or assessment of student learning. As a point of clarity, OPMs often deliver instruction for these programs in addition to providing technical support. When an OPM delivers 25% or more of an educational program, this is considered a written arrangement. Next slide. Okay, so written arrangements do not require a substantive change when the third party first is accredited by a USDE recognized accreditor, when the third party provides only instruction for non-credit or non-Title IV eligible educational programs, including gap year experiences, or when the third party is an institution of higher education that will be sharing responsibilities for an educational program while the member institution will maintain general oversight of the program. Examples include a training academy, articulation agreement, or a dual degree program. Next slide. Additional types of written arrangements that do not require a substantive change include when the third party provides visiting instruction in a course that belongs to the institution and that is overseen by a qualified instructor employed by the institution. When it's solely for goods or services that support the learning environment, but are not for the provision or delivery of instruction in credit-bearing or Title IV eligible education programs. When it provides only goods or services that support the educational program, such as the platform for online instruction. And when it establishes conventional arrangements for internships, clinical placements, practica, and/or study abroad courses or programs. Next slide. There are two types of written arrangements, domestic and international. We're going to start with domestic. A written arrangement is considered domestic if it is an arrangement with an entity that is located or based in the United States, and the program will be implemented in a location in the United States. The substantive change request requires the institution to provide information that includes the name and location of the other institutions or third-party providers, the percentage of the program offered by the third party using the federal calculation provided in the substantive change request form, a description of the services offered by the third party, including the method of delivery, and the terms and conditions of the contract, and a copy of the final contract. Next slide. Additional information required in substantive change requests for domestic written arrangements include evidence of the required public disclosures for written arrangements in accordance with the Commission's public disclosures policy and procedures and federal regulations, and evidence that the institution maintains proper ownership and control of the educational program. Next slide. A written arrangement is considered international if it's an arrangement with an entity that is based outside of the United States, or it will be implemented at a location that is outside of the United States. This substantive change request requires institutions to provide the same information required for a domestic written arrangement. However, additional information about international licensing, regulatory, and legal requirements is also required. International written arrangements require that the contract and all legal contractual documents be translated into English, and that translation must be a certified legal translation and accompanied by a certificate of translation accuracy. Next slide. International written arrangements also require that the institution provide written documentation that the international third-party provider is legally qualified to enter into the contract with the institution. Written arrangements between international third-party providers must clearly address the legal jurisdiction under which its provisions will be interpreted. It's also important to note that the Commission will conduct a legal review of this type of request, which may take longer to process. Next slide. On the screen, you see a list of criteria that must be included in the substantive change request. The Commission may reject the request if the criteria outlined in the substantive change request form are not met, or if there are discrepancies or potential violations of Commission policy, procedures, or federal regulations identified in the request. The criteria include, but are not limited to, the items you see on the screen and which we discussed in the previous slides. Next slide. This slide includes some additional criteria required for the approval of written arrangements. The substantive change request also may be rejected if the institution cannot demonstrate to the satisfaction of the Commission that the written arrangement does not adversely affect the institution's ability to sustain ongoing compliance with the Commission's Standards for Accreditations and Requirements of Affiliation, 14th edition, evidence expectations by standard guidelines, policies and procedures, or applicable regulatory requirements related to the use of third-party providers. Marketing and recruitment should be closely scrutinized and are grounds for rejection as well. It's also important to note that reviewers may request additional information as part of the review process. Next slide. In accordance with the Commission's substantive change policy and procedures, substantive change guidelines, and federal regulations, the institution must provide required notifications or obtain prior approvals from the Commission for written arrangements wherein less than 25% of a credit-bearing educational program is provided by a third-party provider. Institutions provide this notification using the substantive change screening form in the Middle States Institutional Portal, which provides screening questions and guidance and applies logic to ascertain if the institution needs to submit required notifications or prior approvals depending on its accreditation status. Next slide. If an institution has had any non-compliance action in the past 3 years or is under a provisional certification for participation in Title IV programs, they will need to obtain approval by using the appropriate prior approval request form found on the Middle States website. The substantive change policy and procedures provides additional guidance on this topic. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to the Commission's Senior Vice President for Legal Affairs and General Counsel, Tracy Schneider, to discuss the current regulatory environment.
Thanks so much, Judy. So while the Commission has developed its third-party provider policies and procedures, and you've heard so much about those today, we aren't going to ignore the fact that the regulatory environment in this particular area surrounding the provision of services by third parties has been a very active regulatory environment. And we do want to take just a minute to outline what I'm going to refer to as the external regulatory environment. And I'm doing that so we can distinguish all of the external components, the requirements that may be in place by other regulatory bodies, to distinguish them from what we just talked about here, which is the commission's requirements and its policies and procedures. Now, admittedly, that institutions and some external groups have confused the work of the commission related to third-party providers and this external regulatory environment. So we really wanted to provide and hope to provide some clarification for you here to distinguish the commission's requirements from the requirements of other regulators. Not here to speak about the United States Department of Education's requirements for third parties. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it simply to distinguish them from the commission's requirements. So you're going to get the lawyer's disclaimer. I'm not speaking on behalf of the department, and I'm not interpreting for the department. I am simply providing some information that will hope to clarify some of the differences between what the commission's requirements are and the requirements of the other regulators. So as it relates to an institution's arrangement with third parties, the United States Department of Education has requirements in two primary areas. Written arrangements is one, and you've already heard a lot about that, but I'm going to share a little bit more information. And the other is third-party servicers. And I've been talking about third parties. You've heard a lot about third-party providers here today. And so I'm very specific when I talk about the United States Department of Education's requirements as third-party servicers. And I will come back to the difference in those terms in just a minute. Next slide, please. So first, let's take a moment to continue our discussion of written arrangements. Specific to the United States Department of Education's requirements, on June 16, 2022, the United States Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter, and it was related to written arrangements between institutions and third-party entities. And this provided some very specific guidance about what activities might constitute a written arrangement. So the department always had a regulation governing this topic, and it always had requirements for written arrangements. What the third party, what the Dear Colleague letter for the third party entities provided was some clarification as to how the department was interpreting written arrangements. It also identified, the departments also always had requirements that identified contracts between an institution and a third party servicer. And some of those regulatory requirements are on the screen before you. And I will come back again to that third-party servicer requirement, but those regulations have always been in place, and the department was providing some additional guidance on how it was going to interpret and enforce those regulations. For the commission and its requirements for written arrangements, I do want to make it clear that the commission always reviewed written arrangements in accordance with federal regulation. Nothing in our third-party providers' policy and procedures and our substantive change policies and procedures created a new requirement for review of written arrangements. They were always part of our substantive change requirements. Nothing has changed in that regard, except that we have incorporated some of the requirements and references in the United States Department of Education's Dear Colleague letter and regulations into the third-party providers policy and procedure. As you heard Bridget say in the beginning, this was a culmination to bring information together in a very structured and specific way into the third-party providers policy. It continues also to be outlined clearly in the Commission's substantive change policies and procedures, again, which you have heard a lot about today. So nothing is new in that particular area other than to incorporate some of those specific references to the Dear Colleague letter and bring those into our policies and procedures so that everything was referenced appropriately and in the right manner. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that there are two areas that the United States Department of Education covers as it relates to third parties. One was written arrangements, and the other is the third-party servicers. And again, I noted that the department has always had regulations in this particular area. So let's look for a minute, since we've covered the written arrangements, at third-party servicers. And to do that, I want to visit the definitions and the difference in terminology that's utilized by the Commission and the United States Department of Education. The Commission's third-party providers policy and procedure, as you've heard today, governs the institution's relationship with a third-party provider as the Commission defines it. The United States Department of Education's regulations regulate third-party servicers as they relate to the provision of Title IV only. That's the United States Department of Education's purpose as it relates to Title IV, and rightfully so. That's where the United States Department of Education places their focus and concern. The Commission has a different purpose. The Commission's purpose is to review arrangements that allow for a third party to provide services to the institution and are acting in the name of the institution as it relates to accreditation. That is why the Commission's purpose is distinguishable from the Department of Education's purpose. It may seem like a mere parsing of words that we're talking about third-party providers versus third-party servicers, but these definitions and purposes are distinctive. They did serve to cause some confusion because the Commission was acting at a time where this external regulatory environment also had some very specific activity. The Commission's third-party providers policy and procedure are not a facilitation of the department's third-party servicers guidelines. And I'm going to expand on that just a little bit so that I can help to illustrate the difference. And it's not just the words that I'm saying, but you can really see the Commission's purpose as separate and distinct, and its guidelines as separate and distinct from the Department of Education's. Next slide, please. In February of 2023, the United States Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter outlining the requirements for disclosure of contracts with third-party servicers. The required disclosures were broad, and they were broad as acknowledged by many public comments, including a public comment by the Commission. The Commission issued a public comment, submitted a public comment in response to the guidance that was proposed by the department. And we noted the breadth of the department's requirements. That's one of the ways that we hope to clarify for people that the Commission wasn't simply serving to implement the department's requirements. We thought those disclosure requirements were too broad, and we issued a public comment in response to that in order to support institutions and in order to help the Department of Education understand the accreditor's perspective on its requirements. In May of 2023, after much advocacy by accreditors, institutions, and other interested entities, the United States Department of Education removed the effective date and put a hold on its third-party servicer guidance. And again, this is the United States Department of Education's guidance, not the Commission's. And it's their terminology, the use of third-party servicer. And we say this and we make this distinction because some of the comments that we received in response to our proposed policies reference third-party servicers. And so we understood that there was confusion between, probably based on timing, between the Department of Education's guidance and the policy changes that were being put into place by the Commission. The Commission cares about third-party providers in the way that the Commission defines that term. It's not nearly as broad as the disclosure requirements of the United States Department of Education, and the Commission's requirements have nowhere near the breadth of those of the Department of Education. We're focused on a different purpose, and we have different requirements for discussion of contracts, as you've heard today, and also approval of contracts that relate to third-party providers. And the Commission's disclosure requirements are integrated into the evidence expectations by standard guidelines for accreditation activities and the substantive change policies and procedures. And with that discussion of the regulatory environment, we are going to shift into our question and answer period. And I'm going to continue talking about some of the, starting us off with some of the questions, and my colleagues are going to jump in and provide some hopefully helpful information for you today. I will say from the start, we did receive some questions in advance. And so I have been trying to track the questions in the Q&A here for a little bit today, and I will work some of those in with the questions that we've received in advance so we can try to answer as many questions as we possibly can today. And we've left a lot of time with which to do that. I will start us off since we have received you have all received a lot of substantive information today. And since we ended with a fun discussion of the regulatory environment, I'm actually going to start us off with a humorous question, because I do appreciate that our first question came in while we were waiting for the webinar to start. I know my colleagues may have seen that too. And somebody is wondering how great it is for us to stare forward until the webinar starts, and wanted us to put that on a scale of 1 to 10. And I will just say, I don't know how my colleagues feel, but for me, it's excellent practice of my poker face and make sure that I can properly give a blank stare whenever possible. So that is, for me, I'll give it a 10. It's a fun activity. I don't know what my colleagues think, but we appreciate that question and the humor that gets to start off our Q&A period. But on to more serious questions. There were a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to group those together about non-credit bearing programs. So some of those came in prior to maybe the more substantive discussion about non-credit bearing programs, but I'm just going to ask generally if we can talk here about what the commission will review and what the commission needs to approve as it relates to non-credit bearing programs. And I think that will address some of the questions. And I don't know if we want to start, Amy or Judy, if you want to start with that, and then we can all just jump in as needed.
Yeah, I will start off. So non-credit programs are considered a student learning opportunity. And so it would fall under standard 3. And it would be reviewed during accreditation activities. But I want to point out that a non-credit program does not require prior approval through substantive change. It is a third-party provider that you should discuss in your self-study, and you would provide the evidence that is required in evidence expectations. But non-credit, third-party providers providing non-credit programs, that is not a sub-change. So that distinction, I see a lot of the questions, I think, still missing that distinction. I don't know,
Thank you,
Judy, if you
Amy.
want to add anything.
Oh, Judy is good with that response. I did see one quick question in here that I think we can answer pretty quickly. Are systems considered related entities? The answer to that is yes. Systems are considered related entities under our policies and procedures and the definition of related entities. Okay, I'll go to one of our questions that came to us in advance. And this question is about establishing short-term contracts with individuals to help the work of an area when work exceeds the capacity of existing employees. So the question is, to the extent to which, under those circumstances, are contracts with individuals covered by this policy? And I will say either maybe Bridget or Amy. Amy came off mute, so Amy really wants to answer that question.
The scope of the third-party providers policy and procedures does not include individual employment contracts with individuals.
Thank you, Amy. All right, there's a question in here, and it may have been answered throughout the presentation, but there seems to be some confusion about, for the purposes of substantive change, the 25% threshold, whether that is 25 or more, or whether that is just more than 25%. And I know Amy, again, coming off mute. Amy wants to answer that question.
It's 25% or more.
25% or more. Thank you very much. There is a question that we also received in advance, and that's about what type of information can be in the contracts, or what type of information, I should say, can be redacted from contracts. So everyone, a lot of people are concerned sometimes when an institution has to submit a legal contract between itself and another entity, and what portions of that contract could maybe be redacted before sending it to the commission, what portions of the contract we really need to review and see, and whether or not there's any possibility of those contracts being subjected to public disclosure laws. So I will start off with the answer on this one because I think I can start clearly by saying the commission is not subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. In other words, we are not bound by the requirements that we have to disclose those contracts as they come into us under a FOIA request. And Freedom of Information Act, for those of you who are not familiar, we fondly refer to as FOIA. So we do not. We understand that we work with public entities, and those public entities, public institutions may have their own public records requirements. That's not what we're speaking to. We're speaking to the requirements of the commission having to disclose those contracts. With that said, the commission does have to report to the Department of Education under its recognition and under the regulations that apply to accreditors. In doing so, we do often have to provide information to the Department of Education, and the Department of Education is subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So it is possible that they would receive a Freedom of Information Act request. And if it were to incorporate any type of information about an institution, the regulations do allow and require the Department of Education to come back to the commission and have an opportunity to redact information. We do always take that opportunity to redact information before the Department of Education answers and provides information that we have provided to them. So I know that sounds a little bit complicated, but we do get an opportunity to redact. Now, with all of that said, is it possible for an institution to redact certain pieces of information from its third-party providers' contracts before submitting to the commission? And I would say generally that there are pieces that could be marked as confidential, described as proprietary, and which the institution could identify as something that it would not want released, or that it would want redacted if that was ever going to be subjected to a Freedom of Information Act request. However, we can't say wholly that the institution can redact whatever it wants from its contracts, because as you heard Judy share with you, those contracts receive a legal review. So we do have to verify information in the contracts. We do hold that information confidential. We don't release them. But we do have to verify some of the information that is included in those contracts. So we can't just make a blanket statement that says you can redact whatever you need from the contract. But what I would say is this: please consult with your vice president liaison. If there's information that you are concerned about in the contract, please explain to them why you're concerned, and they will help and assist in finding out what information we absolutely need to review and what information could be redacted from a contract. I hope that answers the question, and that the individual who asked that question is on today and is receiving this information. There was a question in here, I think another fairly simple question about publishing the exceptions that we talked about here today, and I believe you'll receive a copy of this webinar presentation, PowerPoint presentation, as we conclude. So you will see the exceptions that way. I will also say that all of the vice president liaisons have those exceptions available to them and can help answer those questions. And I will identify, I don't know if there are other places where those exceptions might sit. There are some explanations given in policy and procedure, but I don't know if there's other places where those will be planned to be released.
The exceptions are in the third-party providers, at least related to goods, services, software. It is in the third-party providers' procedures. And then we also do reference the substantive change guidelines. And the section on written arrangements, there's almost in a whole entire page on these exceptions.
Thanks, Amy. There is a joint question here, and there's one, it is in part about non-credit programs, but it's also in part about online program managers. So I know we talked a little bit about definitions and how online program managers are included in our policies and procedures. So I will, if we can talk generally about what an online program manager is and how that falls within our policies and procedures. We can talk a little bit about that. Judy, Amy. And I'm also happy to talk about it. And I will get it. Amy's coming off. I'll get us started, but Amy, ready?
I didn't want to take all the.
No, you
the
have fun.
attention.
Amy.
All right, so an online program manager, we know that these typically they provide the technical support to get your programs online. They are a third-party provider when they offer for credit-bearing programs and deliver instruction. We would want them to be approved through subchange. Otherwise, Standard 4 asks institutions to provide evidence about OPMs, your use of OPMs, because this Standard 4 is about the delivery of the student experience, and that includes the delivery of online education. So whether it be for credit or non-credit, it falls under Standard 4, and you're asked to provide an analysis of the services you use with an OPM, and it is about delivery. If the OPM offers credit-bearing instruction as part of their services, we require a subchange. Very hard to, it's a subtle difference, but.
I will also share that I think when as it refers to online program managers, there is some confusion or concern perhaps because the Government Accountability Office issued a report a number of years back now about online program managers. This is for the Commission's perspective. Nothing in that report has been incorporated into our policies and procedures. Our policies and procedures address online program managers as they pertain to written arrangements, substantive change requirements, and obviously the disclosures that would happen during self-study. So we are not serving to restrict online program managers based on any government reports, simply defining online program managers for the purpose of implementing our substantive change policies and procedures. Because I think that's another area sometimes where people are confused. They hear that terminology and they think there's some additional scrutiny. We certainly look carefully into the requirements, but we do that because of the services that are provided. And we just need to make sure that everything being done in the institution's name as it relates to accreditation is being properly reviewed in accordance with federal regulation and our own policies and procedures. Okay, more questions. We have a lot of questions about, and I don't know the extent to which we've considered all of the possibilities for goods and services that may be exempt. But there's a lot of questions in here about goods and services. And I do want to make one point. We won't necessarily be able to address every single scenario, every single exemption, every single type of goods and service that may be included. So I will ask probably Bridget and Amy to identify if there are other categories of goods and services that may have been discussed during the policy process or examples. I'll also ask Judy if there's any examples that institutions have provided that she's seen. But what I will say is this, from the policy and procedure perspective, we can't list all of the goods and services. But there are some questions that have come up about dining, food services, cleaning staff. So I wonder if there are any other exceptions or exemptions that we would want to talk about here, or other ways that we could talk about those goods and services exceptions.
Yeah, it is very difficult to try to think of exceptions. You know, I can say there was a question about LMS. An LMS alone is not a third-party provider. It's a software program. you know, we goods, books, supplies, products, equipment, or software programs. You know, I'm not quite sure what to add to that.
I don't have specifics to add, Amy, but I did want to mention that we as an organization, these were questions that were echoed again and again in some of the feedback that we received through our public comment process. And so we did disclose some of the information and the questions and comments that we got, and that included questions about what was considered a third-party provider under that process. And so we do have a summary of the public comment that we received and the commission's written response if you are interested in reading about anyone else's questions and how the commission wrote out responses to that. That is available on our website for the first time that we've done that. But yes, we did receive a number of comments, and I can't think of anything else off the top of my head that isn't really in those broad categories already.
The only thing I would add to that is articulation agreements are not considered third-party providers because they're with a Title IV eligible institution in the most case. Transfer agreements are not considered third-party providers. And I see a lot of questions here about learning management systems. That is a type of software that is also excluded and not considered a third-party provider.
Thank you all for that. Appreciate it. On a related topic, I believe it's related. Is there some question or concern about the definition or the way that the commission would define key as part of key business functions? And what I would say is the commission works hard to acknowledge the differences between institutions and the work that gets done across. We have institutions of many different types, sizes, structures, missions, and we work hard in our policies and procedures to be able to honor the different unique situations that exist in different institutions. So when you see terminology like that, and I'm not going to seek to define key, nor am I going to ask any of my colleagues to define key for the purposes here. I'm simply going to say that generally speaking, we are going to look at the specific circumstances, as the commission always does, for the institution. And so if there are questions, and there's a number of questions about specific providers in the Q&A, we are not going to answer questions about specific providers. What I will say to you is this, and we're going to encourage, and I'll let Judy talk a little bit about the relationship between the vice president liaisons and how they can support institutions in this process. But if you have a specific question that we're not answering, it's not because we're not intending to answer your question. We're not going to talk about specific providers here. But if you have a specific question about your institution, whether or not something would be considered a key business function, whether or not a particular contract with a third party would fall within the definitions, please contact your vice president liaison. They are the individuals who can provide some assistance. And on cue, Judy has come off to share all of the ways that the vice presidents can help.
Yeah, the vice presidents are going to love me for reinforcing this, but we're here to answer any questions that you have. And, obviously the policy is written in a way that there are going to have to be some very specific, there's going to have to be context that's going to need to be included in this review with some of the general questions that are being asked about specific types of arrangements and whether they're third party or not. So it may be a little bit of, hey, we might ask a few questions, we might ask for a little bit more context, but we will get them answered by reviewing them against the policy and procedures that were just put in place on January 1st. We know you've got a lot of questions. We're here to help.
Thanks, Judy. And thank you to all the vice president liaisons who I know are helping. All right, we have a question that came to us in advance, and it's about the provision of our policy and procedures that say contracts must include procedures for addressing grievances. So the question here is whether this is meant to refer to grievances between the college and the third-party vendor, or between students and the college or the vendor. I am not sure who might want to answer that, but I'm going to tag in Bridget first and see if Bridget would like to answer that question. Otherwise, I am happy to provide an answer.
Sure. So procedures for addressing grievances applies to grievances between the college and the third-party vendor or between students and the college, so it applies to both scenarios. And we also would want to see a grievance process for students related to an arrangement with a third-party provider, so that should be included in your policy and procedures.
Thank you, Bridget. Okay. Another question that we have is about dual enrollment programs. There's several questions here about dual enrollment programs.
Dual enrollment programs do not fall under the category of third-party providers.
Thank you, Judy. We have some questions here about if self-study began under the 13th edition of the standards. Does the third-party provider policy apply to those institutions?
There are requirements for third-party providers in both 13th and 14th edition.
And just a reminder here too, that these, in addition to being incorporated into the standards, the policies and procedures that we're discussing here, there were aspects of this in existence before this most recent revision and addition of the policy and procedure. So many of these things were in place already and have always been in place in our substantive change policies and procedures as well. So in addition to that, just be reminded that a lot of these requirements were in place and institutions have been complying with these requirements, and we were bringing things together in one centralized location. All right, we already talked. So there's a question in the Q&A, and there's also a question received in advance specific about the what qualifies as 25% of a program's delivery and what qualifies as program delivery. Does the 25% threshold refer solely to instruction, or does it include other services such as curriculum development, counseling, advising, assessment, or other services?
Generally, the percentage, which is outlined and explained in the substantive change request form for written arrangements, does focus on the number of credit hours. But if a third party is providing that range of services, then you do want to think about that. That's what puts it into the category of a third party provider of a written arrangement. But the percentage is a calculation that is a federal calculation, and it looks at the number of credit hours.
We had a question prior to what's in the chat and prior to our webinar about study abroad programs and whether contracting with providers for study abroad programs would count as a third-party provider.
They are considered a third-party provider. They don't require prior approval. So they fall under standard 3, where you want to discuss how you provide those services and provide the evidence that's requested in the evidence expectations document. You do not have to come to us for approval of those through substantive change.
We have a question here about when calculating the 25% threshold, should this be done program by program or solely at the institutional level?
It's a program. Because a written arrangement is for the provision of the credit-bearing educational program, each one is going to be about the program. So if you have more than one program that you're bringing to us, it would be separate sub-change requests.
Thank you, Amy. Here, and we talked a little bit about this, about software programs, learning management systems. There's several questions here about with so many institutions using proprietary software programs to organize and manage assessment. Are these what is meant by third-party providers for assessment, Or does this apply more to those who purport to conduct assessment for others in its entirety?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
Um,
An LMS or, I mean, a software program is not considered a third-party provider. We do assessment services are included. But that's when you're working with someone to assist you with your assessment efforts.
I think you hit the distinction here that the question was getting to, and if not, the individual who asked that question can ask again.
I think they're referencing assessment management systems to organize and contain the different assessment processes and assessments. And if it's just the software program, it would not fall under the third party.
We have a question here too about confirming the clarity and the implementation timing. And this individual thought they heard that only reviewing written arrangements going into effect starting January 1st, 2024 and forward. I think we can safely say that we have been reviewing written arrangements for quite some time. And that includes prior to January 1st, 2024. So I can promise you that the written arrangements have been reviewed prior to this. So I just want to clarify that for the individual who asked the question.
Yeah,
I think they were discussing contracts with third-party providers. And in that case, there are very specific elements that need to be required, that are required in a contract with third-party providers for contracts that are fully executed January 1st, 2024 or later. I also saw a question in here about, hey, if we're renegotiating a contract, do we need to include all of that? Yes, you do need to include it. Any new contracts or revised contracts filed after January 1st, 2024 with a third-party provider, please do reference the policy and procedures because there's a list of elements that needs to be included in that contract.
And there's a question in here about what needs to be provided during the review. I'm assuming we're talking here about the substantive change review, and those are specific to what's in the substantive change forms that we ask for institutions to complete, and also any of the additional requirements that the peer evaluators would request. This is a question about notifications. Can you clarify the times when we need to provide notifications and a substantive change is not required?
And Tracy, I can take that one. There are 4 different types of required notifications. They include a change in the existing program's method of delivery, an aggregate change of 25% or more of a program's curriculum, customized pathways or modified programs, and we talked about this during the webinar, written arrangements for the provision of 1 to 24% of an educational program.
And that is credit bearing.
We have a question here about if institutions are using a online testing service and don't have a contract, and they would like to know how to document that. And so I think the question here is if there are, I think it's an opportunity to revisit what we talked about, what's been talked about during the presentation, which there are relationships with third-party providers that you would want to identify, talk about, discuss, and self-study. And then there's an approval process. The approval process requires the approval for a contractual relationship with a third-party provider. Sorry, give me a moment as I'm trying to go through some of these. This one is the college has a tutoring department with its own employees and also provides students with the opportunity for third-party 24/7 tutoring. Can you use this example to explain how the third-party relationship would exist in that scenario? Okay, so we're not jumping in with a specific answer to that question. So I would say this: it is hard in kind of the general hypothetical situations, though I appreciate that individuals are asking hypotheticals, so they're not asking about specific providers. But it is difficult for all of us in the hypothetical situation to answer a particular question. So in those scenarios, I would say it sounds like there's a specific arrangement here that you would want to ask more questions about. And so we're going to encourage you to discuss with your vice president liaison, who can provide some more specifics and ask you questions that will elicit some more specific information. And then we can, your vice president liaison can work with our policy unit to be able to understand where those types of arrangements would fall within our policies and procedures. So there is a question here, and it came in fairly early on about internships and clinical placement providers, understanding that they're community partners who supervise clinical practices in the community, and whether or not those are third-party providers. For example, clinical social work externship program, that's part of an academic program. Another example might include a local school district where student teachers perform the student teaching requirements to earn teacher certification. If we could talk for a minute about any type of clinical placement program or the relationships of those programs. Or is that another hypothetical that would be
Well, I
difficult?
mean, in a very general sense, a clinical experience of any sort is and can be a third-party provider that is discussed during the self-study or during accreditation activities. And you provide the evidence that's requested and the evidence expectations. It's not one that requires approval, prior approval through subchange.
Thanks, Amy. And one of the questions here is, it was noted that the institution must retain control over the curriculum and program. It doesn't say who at the institution should retain that control. Are faculty involved in this control, or is it primarily administration? So I'm going to start this off, and then if somebody else has anything that they want to contribute to that. From the commission's perspective, we are concerned about the difference between the institution maintaining control and the third-party provider having control. We're not specific about whether or not it's faculty or administration who's providing that control. We are simply saying it's the institution, as distinguished between the third-party provider, who has to provide the level of control over the curriculum and the program. Of course, then institutions have their own mechanisms, and we talked about this a little bit earlier about how institutions have different arrangements with faculty, shared governance, shared responsibilities within the institution for who at the institution would maintain that control. The commission only asks that you tell us that arrangement, that you explain to us, you be transparent about who at the institution is going to be administering that portion of the program. But for the purposes of the policies and procedures discussed here, we care that it's the institution and not a third-party provider. If anybody else has any additions to that.
The only thing I would add is that is one of the elements that you would need to flush out in the contract with the third-party provider. And that would demonstrate the evidence of the oversight.
And that does bring up a very good point, Judy. Thank you for what goes into the contractual relationship. So the contractual relationships do get reviewed. They get a legal review. That would be me. I review the contracts, and I will make a note here about what Judy's pointing out. we require it to be in the contractual relationship or the contractual agreement with the third-party provider, because that's the form in which we verify and show that it's enforceable. So that's an enforceable arrangement. There may be other mechanisms, policies, procedures, guidelines, protocols that you may have with the third-party provider. All of those are helpful information to share with us to supplement the contract. But the more that can be in the contract, the easier it is for the commission to verify and to know that you can, the institution can hold itself and the third-party provider accountable for what's in that arrangement. I'm going to scroll back down to the bottom because I know things have been added as I've been talking about them, and I haven't been reviewing some of these. So let me just take a quick look. Let's see. Some of these are specific, so I'm just making sure that I cover them. So follow up on timing during an accreditation activity. Should we only discuss third-party agreements that are active at the time of self-study, or do we have to cover past inactive contracts over the past 3 to 5 years, the typical time period for evidence we are providing?
What you need to provide is in evidence expectations by standard. It's a sample of your contracts, current contracts. And it does ask for the past 4 years. So that's in the evidence expectations. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember everything, but it's a list with the name, a percentage of the program, a description of the services offered by the third party.
So looking at another recent question that we received, when an institution has a third-party provider agreement where the third party is providing services that cannot be directly associated to the credit or clock hours of a program, how should we address the issue in calculating the percentage of the program for substantive change? And we have an example here. For example, the third-party provider just provides marketing or recruiting to a limited population of prospective students, for example, employees of certain companies, or is this simply not a written arrangement and therefore we don't need to calculate the percentage of a program?
Right.
And it would be
not a written arrangement.
Thank you, Amy.
I can take the with 2
Go ahead.
colleges jointly registered a credit
I was
bearing
gonna ask
program.
you that one.
No, that's not. They are student learning opportunities, right? Maybe it's a dual degree or it's a joint program between 2 accredited institutions. Would not require sub-change approval.
And so for Amy's comment, because I know that the participants can't see that question, if 2 colleges have jointly registered a credit-bearing program with their state regulatory board, are the 2 colleges third parties of one another, or are they not third parties because they're both individually accredited? We have written arrangements with international universities to have a dual degree program.
That's a tougher one that I think we would need more information. Internationals typically, they do not have US recognized accreditation. So it's a possibility, but I think we need to look more at the context.
Is the provision of technical support, enrollment services, internship placement, et cetera, by OPMs without offering instruction necessitate a substantive change, leaving instruction to the university?
That would not require sub-change, but you would want to talk about what the OPM offers in under standard 4.
This is a course sharing consortium in which students can take online courses for credit. Is the consortium considered a third-party provider?
Do you need more information? Are they accredited institutions of higher education in the consortium? If they are, would not require a sub change.
I think we're nearing the end of the more generalized questions that we can answer, and I know we're nearing the end of our webinar as well. I don't know if anybody has any final thoughts, questions that they thought of that we haven't yet been able to address. Now would be the time to ask us those questions. And if not, we will talk about our resources. We do have a slide. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't say next slide. We do have a slide that shares some of the resources that we have available to you. And those are the third-party providers policy and procedures, the substantive change policy and procedures, substantive change guidelines, and the substantive change request form specific type that would apply to these arrangements. And those are all available on our website. I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now. See if there's anything last minute here that we haven't gotten to. Oh, we have a how soon will the presentation be available? I think we can answer that question that I know our events team will provide that via email following up on the presentation, and they usually do that in a very quick turnaround time. So you should have that fairly soon and within the next few days. And I think I covered it all. So I will go on to our last slide. That thanks everybody tremendously for all of your excellent questions today. I want to thank my colleagues for being part of this presentation and for providing the excellent substance. I know we got a lot of questions throughout the policy revision process, and we engaged in that public comment process and provided a lot of additional explanation. We've gotten a lot of questions. To the extent there's follow-up questions, again, please contact your vice president liaisons. They are not the only people who will answer those questions, but they are in a position to coordinate across units so we can all provide some helpful information. And if you have questions that we didn't answer because we didn't have enough detail, or questions about a specific provider and specific circumstances of your institution, we are happy to answer those questions. So please do not think for a second that we won't answer those questions. It's just very difficult in this context to be able to understand all of the unique circumstances that are going on with institutions. And we ask you to follow us on all of our social media. We really thank you for your time today. We appreciate it.